This workshop is the Understanding and Addressing Microaggressions workshop. If that's not what you were expecting, feel free to stick around and participate anyway. But yes, this is it's going to be an awesome workshop. Christina Crawford is our facilitator. She is an associate. Yeah, she's waving. Thank you, Christina. She is an associate director for science and engineering at the Rice Office of STEM Engagement, which is known as RSTEM. Christina guides Houston area high school teachers to explore both science and engineering concepts and how they can be taught using inquiry and project-based methods. Christina also works with the Newt Center and leads their nanotechnology environmental engineering for teachers and the Newt research experience for teachers programs. Christina believes the world and the humans that live in it are only truly valued when individuals come together to share unique, diverse, and sometimes opposing perspectives. The celebration of diversity and the inclusion of all ideas creates a critical consciousness of the world today and paves the way for a sustainable and prosperous future. Christina currently has a BS in biology from Texas A&M Corpus Christi, Master's of Science in Education from the University of Houston, and is a PhD student at the University of Houston studying urban education. So thank you, Christina, for presenting.
All right, so good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Emily, for that introduction, and thank you all for taking the time out of your busy schedules for being with us today as we discuss microaggression. If needed, the link for the presentation that you are going to enjoy or participate in today will be shared with everyone. I do want to start off by saying that this presentation that I'm going to engage you in is based on an experience that I had. And instead of being remaining trapped in the emotions and the mind games of that event, one of my professors encouraged me to be reflective and mindful of the needs that I had to explore of getting out of those microaggressions and the feelings and emotions. So my goal for this presentation and to get through this session today on understanding and addressing microaggressions is to help you be more reflective of your needs around microaggressions and possibly to promote actions to take place. Now, I do not want this session to be about me talking the entire time. So like they said, there will be breakout sessions today, and there is going to be engagement through an app called Slido that we're going to use. And so Slido is going to be a formative assessment. You will either use your cell phone or you will use your internet browser in order to engage with that. I also encourage you to ask any questions that you may have through the chat at any time. Also, there's going to be times where I'm going to stop and ask you to verbally respond to some of the questions I have. And if you feel comfortable doing that, I'm going to ask you to use the raise your hand feature so that I can call on you. And if you've never used that feature before, you can find that by clicking on the participants icon to find that. And so that I don't call on anyone in particular who doesn't feel comfortable speaking, please click on the raise your hand so that I can call on someone who does feel comfortable speaking. All right, so for the essential understandings today, instead of saying exactly what you're going to get out of this session, because I don't know what those might be, I want you to be mindful of a couple of different questions that I want you to be able to try to answer by the end of the session. All right, so for understanding what microaggressions are, I want you to try to answer what is or is not a microaggression. What are the different forms of microaggression? And what are the signs someone has suffered a microaggression? And then for the second half or the presentation or the end portion of the presentation, we're going to get to addressing microaggressions. So how can individuals not commit microaggressions? And what can be done if a microaggression is committed? And how can microaggressions be prevented? Now, earlier when Emily was talking, she kind of gave my introduction. She said that we use inquiry and active learning in a lot of the professional developments that I lead. So we're going to use that same kind of methodology in this workshop today. And so I'm not going to just straight out give you the definition that I found in a journal somewhere of microaggression. I'm going to take you through a couple of different scenarios so that we can kind of formulate what the definition of microaggression is based on going through some of these scenarios. All right, so let's go ahead and start with that. So let's examine two different cases. Here's the first case. So case A, we have a white male, he's an engineering professor, and he says to a colleague, someone mistook me, and let me go ahead and do this as well. Someone mistook me for a security guard. A colleague asks him, how do you feel? He responds, fine, it was funny. In case B, an African-American male, an engineering professor says, someone mistook me for a security guard. A colleague asks, how do you feel? He responds, I am sick of it. No one ever sees me or people who look like me as a professional with a degree. I want you to think for a second and determine in which case do you feel a microaggression has been experienced? Okay, now I want you to engage in which answer. So you can use your cell phone or you can put this into the poll. Okay, you can either scan the QR code or you can go directly into the internet. Now, I do not collect any information on the person who is putting in their response. So these responses are anonymous. So you can either put case A, you can put case B, you can put both, or you can put neither. All right, so let's look at our results. All right, so 65% said that case B was the microaggression, while 29% said that both, 3% said A, and 3% said neither. Okay, so let's actually analyze these two cases. All right, so before I go back to the cases, I want to think about what are the differences between these two cases. What are some differences between the two cases that we can point out?
Well, in the first case, good afternoon, Christina. My name is Aziza. In the first case, the response seems to be comical. It says fine, it was funny. Now, we don't really know, we can only go based off of the words, but we don't really know if that was a defense mechanism or not, and whether or not this person was actually offended, but it just appears as, we can take it that it says fine. Whereas case B, they're frustrated. The person responding feels frustrated. And rather than talking about the experience as an isolated event, the experience is being broadened out into a general, almost like a general outcry of, feeling unprofessional or being assumed as unprofessional.
Okay, I see that Victoria, you have your hand raised. You have something different that you want to share. What are some differences that we see between the cases?
I think she hit everything that I was going for, the dominant group, and especially in case B, it seems to be a pattern. And so it maybe is speaking to something this person is getting over and over again as maybe not part of the dominant group in engineering.
Okay. All right, so I see also some items in the chat that talks about person A is from a dominant group, person B is from a target or marginalized group. Case B is a racist or stereotype towards the professor. What are some similarities between these two cases? Because we had some people say that it was both or that it was neither. So what are some similarities between the two cases? What were some, okay, so we said that they were male, that they're both engineering professors. Are there any other similarities that we can see?
In the chat, Spurston, with the issues with the viewing it, both professors are male, the misrepresentation made, and both are engineering professors, a career path that is male dominated. Assumption was made by a colleague, in parentheses, is the colleague, a fellow engineering professor, and target of assumption / bias. So those are some of the comments in the chat.
All right. All right. So let's go ahead and look at this. So case A was not a microaggression. In case A, we had a white male who was an engineering professor whose feelings were not hurt. The incident did not relate to his identity. And as a member of a dominant group, it may have been easier for him to just dismiss the event as a one-off. But in case B, the African-American male did feel hurt by the event, and he did express feelings of hurt. The perception is that the event would not have occurred if he was not an African-American male. Even though we did have evidence, or there was this case A that did occur, the perception is that it would not have occurred. And the case alludes to a pattern when he talks about this. Now, like we said, both males had the same position at the institution, and both individuals' roles in that organization were incorrectly assumed. And no information was given about the party who made the assumption. But we have to remember, a lot of times when people make assumptions about others, it's not about the individual who's making the assumption. Because a lot of times people make the excuse, well, I didn't make any offense by my comment because I have an individual from this, or because I'm from this particular background myself, or I have best friends who become, who've also experienced other things. When these type of events happen, it's not about that particular person. It's about the person who's feeling the experience, who's going through the experience. So we have to remember it's not the individuals who's doing the transgression. It's the person whose feelings are hurt and who's being individualized in that particular moment, right? So it doesn't matter who is doing the microaggression in that particular moment. Everyone has the capability of individualizing someone. So the information was purposely not given about the individual who targeted the other person. So we have to remember that there is always a difference between perception and reality. So I want y'all to look at this picture. And in this image, we have a person who was driving a car and they ran over somebody's foot. So even though we still haven't gone over what a microaggression is by definition, what do we think this image might be? How do we think it might be associated with microaggressions? So we're thinking about the impact. What is the impact in this particular situation? Okay, we can't use ignorance as an excuse. We can never use ignorance as an excuse. Why? Exactly. Just because you didn't mean to do it doesn't mean it didn't hurt that person. So let's assume maybe this person is a good driver. Does that change the fact that you just injured this individual in a way that will impact him for the rest of their life? Right? They're going to have to live with the feeling of maybe they might have to get their metacarpals refixed or put plastic or metal in their foot or something, you know? They still have to live with that for the rest of their life. What's the internal impact of those actions that you just done? And what are you basing the notion of being a good driver on? Is it just other people who have driven exactly like you your entire life telling you that you're a good driver, right? What is this characteristic of being a good driver actually based off of? So what actually are microaggressions? So now we're going to actually get into the definitions. So according to Dr. Gerald Wing Su and his colleagues, microaggressions are brief, verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether they're intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile and derogatory or negative slights and insults against individuals from marginalized individuals, identities. And so those identities include race, ethnicity, sexuality, gender, class, disability, sexual status, religious, and even different workplace identities and status. So different levels in your workplace. So whether you are a tenure faculty, a non-tenure faculty, whether you are a faculty member who just decides that you want to be a teaching faculty and non-tenure, you know, those different positions all can cause different ways for people to have perceptions about different people's ability within the workplace. And different people who experience microaggressions have different ways of coping with those microaggressions or internalizing those microaggressions within their environment. So different things and typical types of microaggressions that you might have heard before or seen before that are very common and commonplace. So for example, you may have seen, where are you from? She's too bossy. I didn't know Black women taught engineering, right? These are all statements that people say in passing, right? And you hear them about women, or you hear them about people who look like they are from different nationalities, or you hear them about from people who commonly don't associate with different career choices. But what are the impact of these different statements that they have on these individuals, right? If you were actually say this to this person in their face, what is the statement? All right, what's that impact that that's having on them? Right? It makes those people feel like, you know, do I belong in this particular place? Is it something that I'm doing here? You know, why do they feel like it's okay for them to say it to me? Did I do something to them? You know, so what makes microaggressions really impactful and what research has shown is that minorities and marginalized individuals are more likely to experience immediate distress and long-term effects from microaggressions. And a lot of time this includes depression and negative affect, which is an internalization of this negative feeling that everything that's happening within their life is going to have this negative outcome. And it's slightly different from depression because they keep going on with their daily lives, but they just have a negative outlook about everything that they're doing. And so they have this negative moods and negative emotion, and they have impaired adaptive functions and well-being, low self-esteem, and physical health issues, pain, fatigue, and in certain cases, it could lead to suicide based on prolonged effects. And so microaggressions, even though they use the word micro, it has a lot of compounded effects. Is the screen faded out again? I don't know what's going on.
Yes.
Let me stop sharing it. I don't know what's going on. Let me do it one more time. Is it back? All right, don't worry, I'm gonna put y'all in breakout groups. So this quote right here, it's death by 1,000 cuts. And this kind of gets to kind of the compounding effects of what microaggression has. So if you get a paper cut, right, it's like a little paper cut. That's what people think of like the first time you're microaggressed against, right? But if it happens over and over and over and over again, that pain just kind of builds up. So even if that cut doesn't lead to the death, they have a tremendous effect on workplace and educational outlooks, specifically for minorities in that workplace. And so research has shown that microaggression leads to disengaged workers and in those psychologically unsafe environments. And there's a loss of innovation, productivity, and a sense of empowerment. This usually results in women and minorities being at risk of quitting their jobs and being fired from STEM fields due to not wanting to continue their positions. So what you're going to do now is the team is going to put you in breakout groups, and we're going to investigate microaggressions a little bit more. So in the chat, they have just placed a link. What I want you to do is click on that link, and it's going to take you to a screen where you are going to sort out some scenarios. There are 9 different scenarios in which you are going to sort. With your team, you're going to read through each of these scenarios and determine which of them are most related to the other scenarios and place them within 3 different groups. Once you've created your 3 groups, as a team, you're going to create a description or a name for each of those 3 groups. So kind of describe what is going on between these 3 groups. So you have 9 cards, and you're going to sort each of those cards into 3 groups in however way your team sees fit. You're going to have 15 minutes within this breakout group to complete this activity. Okay, so again, I want to make sure everyone has that link. Speak now if you have not received that link or if you're having trouble viewing that link. All right, so how did y'all do in your groups? How did it go? I was looking at some of the answers that you came up for your naming mechanisms within your team. And so it was kind of interesting. Does anybody want to kind of share some of the methodology that you used in coming up with your naming conventions for some of the terminologies that you use for your categories?
I was wondering if someone else wanted to go. So in my group, we each took a couple minutes to just read through all the scenarios, and then we came together, and I think we spent most of the time thinking about impact, and we actually changed our mind a couple times. So there are a couple things that we moved around a bit. So we tried to see, so one of our categories is called jokingly. So this idea that, oh, it's just a joke, or are you sure you're Black? I'm more Black than you right now. So it's taking, I don't know, using humor to kind of dance around your stereotypes, misconceptions, and, prejudice, right? Prejudice thoughts. And then we started thinking about this idea of a color blindness. So this ignorance around race and racial dynamics. So that was one. And then we just had a miscellaneous one that we just called stereotype / misconception / question mark. So.
Okay, very good. I like that, the way you allowed everyone to individually have a moment to kind of reflect on what they thought and then bringing that together. All right. Did any other group have a way of thinking about how their team tackled or what did they do within their group?
I'll go ahead. Our group, one of the categories we came up with was ignorance or possibly naivete, because we talked about how some of us grew up in, well, especially I was saying I grew up in a part of the country that just didn't have much diversity. And so you almost had the opposite of the usual kind of racial profiling, because it was so unusual to see someone who wasn't Caucasian that they were treated differently, but positively sometimes, just because they were different. And so they may have been overwhelmed by that, but we talked about how there's different forms of ignorance, I guess you could say.
Good, thank you. Thank you. All right, so let's go ahead and look at what the groups were. All right, so like I said, there are 3 distinct groups for the microaggressions. And if your group didn't come up with the grouping exactly like this, that's okay. And again, these
Sorry,
results,
Christina, it's getting fuzzy again.
it's fuzzy again. And I even played with the cords and I switched the monitor. It's got to be something wrong with the laptop itself at this point. But let me stop the share and I'm going to reshare it again.
Maybe it gets too hot. I don't know.
It's being overworked. Let me do this. This is what I'm going to do. Let's do this. I'm going to do it this way so that since I don't have any videos going on anyway, I took off that optimize feature. So maybe it shouldn't be trying to overload it or something. Hopefully that'll fix it. All right. So microaggressions are 3 distinct ways: micro assaults,
Sorry, Christina, now we're just seeing everyone's pictures, so we don't see the slide.
Okay, let's try this one more time.
I love it.
What do y'all see now?
Yes. Perfect.
All right. All right, microaggressions occur in 3 distinct ways. We have micro assaults, micro invalidations, and micro insults. All right, so the first group that we have a white coworker. He attends a Halloween party and he decided to wear a Barack Obama costume. The first part of this, there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with wearing a Barack Obama costume. But then he chose to include blackface with this costume. The second comment here is you walk into a classroom where you have a Jewish engineering professor, and that Jewish professor walks into that classroom and there's swastikas all over the board, and someone yells out, "This was just a joke." Next, you have at the beginning of the class, at the end of the class, you choose to ask for another explanation for a vocabulary word, and then someone says to you, "I know you are, but that's so gay." And so the pattern that you see here is that somebody is intentionally making people aware of the differences of someone's identity in a negative manner. Okay, they are being very intentional of making someone's identity known in a very negative way. All right, and so this is a micro insult. It's a conscious, deliberate form of the discrimination or practice that are intended to harm, and it most likely resembles traditional forms of discrimination. And some people can say that it's on the form of being aggressive. Some people try to say that it can be seen as just trying to get rid of it or being jokey or funny, or they try to write it off. But usually you're identified a person's sexual gender or some type of derogatory slur, or you're telling like a transgender individual that they can't use a certain bathroom, but you are purposely identifying what makes a person different, and you're bringing attention to that in a very explicit way. Okay, and so that's a micro assault. In the second grouping, the cards we have here, so the first one, when asked if a public school funding is well distributed amongst the school districts, the politician says, "I don't see color." In the second one, you have a Black woman who comes into the room and the patient says, "Can you bring in my doctor?" She says, "I am the doctor." And then the last one, a white person telling a Black person that there is no racism. So in all of these instances, basically the individuals are being invalidated, okay? Their identity, the experiences of people who are within their cultures are being invalidated. So these are micro invalidations. And these serve to exclude, negate, or nullify either the physical or psychological thoughts, feelings, or experiences or realities of people of certain identities or groups. So another example of this is assuming that all gay people want to come out, or that they are all very flamboyant, or want to be treated in a particular way, right? And so you are invalidating someone's feelings or how they want to be taught or identified, right? Or invalidating that this woman could actually be the doctor in this particular situation, or that there are differences amongst individuals and that color and identity make a difference within this school district. For the third group, you have an Asian individual talking to a Hispanic person and comparing her to a dog. So comparing her hair to a dog's hair. You have another individual, after learning that the new Black friend could not dance, then you tell them that I'm more Black than you are. So assuming that all Black people can dance. And then in the last one, after learning that that the person is from Trinidad, you see that your people must be proud of you. So in this one, all of the comments, they come across like you may have known this person, or you might have a relationship, or they might actually be happy, about this person, right? And so, it doesn't seem like they had any intent of being wrong or being negative towards these people, and they might have every intent of giving this person a compliment, right? I love my dog. Oh, you must feel happy about your hair. It feels just like my dog's hair. They might be thinking they're giving themselves a compliment, saying that I can dance better than you. I'm more Black than you because I can dance and you can't. Or, your people must be really proud. You're from Trinidad and you're the professor of this class. How wonderful is that, right? But this is a micro insult, right? You don't feel happy being compared to a dog. You don't want to hear that your hair feels like a dog. You don't want to hear that all Black people should be able to dance. Nobody wants to, we don't want to be stereotypes within this group. And so this is like when we were thinking that this is ignorance, as if all people that you meet from this group. And this is where we get into that people talk about unconscious bias. Every time you see a music video, you might see Black people or Hispanic people, dancing in those music videos. So you have that unconscious bias that all Black people or Hispanic people are the ones who can dance, right? And it's just not the case, right? Or you might see, the news media, that Black males are the ones who are getting arrested all the time by the police. So Black males must be always in trouble, or they must be troublemakers. And that's all they are good for, because that's the only way that they are portrayed by the media. And so you make these assumptions about this whole group of people. And so when you say, oh, good for you, you're the one who you got out, that's really saying, no, I'm not the only one who got out, so, where are these things stemming from? And so that's why these are insults when people say these things to you or to others from these different backgrounds. All right, so this micro insult, the use of derogatory terms or actions that is aimed explicitly to degrade a person's identity. Micro invalidation, the rejection or denial of a person's thoughts or feelings because of their identity and experiences. And micro insults, the unintentional idea of or statements that convey disrespect and sensitivity towards a person's identity. All right, so these are the different ways that microaggressions occur against individuals from marginalized groups. All right, so what we're going to do now, we're going to do another Slido. So you can use your phone or your web browser. And what I want you to do is answer this question. And so based on our discussion thus far, what may be a sign that a microaggression has occurred? Now you can enter one word at a time, but you may enter as many words as you need to respond to this question. So thinking about the person who has gone through the microaggression, what's a sign? All right, so let's see what we have here. So this is what we have so far. All right, so the number one thing is we have hurt feelings. Then we have facial expressions, hurt, anger. We also have tears, silence, generalization, marginalization, questioning intent, increased stress, lack of empathy, offended, sudden feelings of embarrassment, powerful differentiation, stereotypes used or applied, discouragement, stereotyping, whether a listener feels hurt, aggression, assumptions, mood change, right? So there are a lot of things going on here, right? So there's a lot of emotionals, micro insults, power dynamic, right? Madness, pain, race, conversation stops, right? There's a lot of things that are going on when we think about microaggression and how we know that something wrong is happening within these conversations or within these actions. All right. And so when we think about signs, you know, y'all kind of hit all of them, right? There's an emotional response. The individual who's been impacted is usually consumed with the event. Usually long term, they reflect about the event, but then they're unsure if they are making too much of it, and they're not sure if they should bring it up. One thing about microaggression is people don't always talk about it. They usually just say, oh, I'll just let it go, or I'm not going to bring it up, or I don't want to make too big of a deal about it, because they don't want this to become a thing. But the entire time they're internalizing the event, and even though they're not making it a thing for someone else, it becomes a thing for themselves. And the other person doesn't even know about it. And so even though I had the cartoon of the individual running over the foot, like when you run over someone's foot, usually you can see it, right? You see that that other person is in pain. A lot of time with microaggressions, these individuals are suffering in silence because you don't even know that they're going through a lot of these emotional effects because of that event. You can only just see the hurt or the anger that's going on, or them being withdrawn, you know, or them having poor grades in school, or them not wanting to socialize anymore. But you don't see the event, or you don't see them actually having the confrontation with the other person out of fear of them saying, well, they're not going to believe me, or they're going to take this other person's side, or if I say something, somebody's going to come back at me because of it. You know, so there's always, like someone said on the other slide, there's that power dynamic. And so they're pretty sure that the person who made the slight, who said something wrong, they don't want to cause any more rift that was already there. So how do we know? How do we know if we are guilty or making a microaggression? So this is just a little diagram or a dichotomous key or flow chart that you can use to kind of vet or your actions or your conversations with other people. And it's really easy to use. I mean, I'm not saying that you have to keep this in your back pocket or take it around or bring it out. Like, hey, before I have this conversation with you, let me check it, look at this diagram and see if this is going to happen. But this is something that you can just use and just read through it. And it seems like to me, it would seem like it would be an obvious thing to check, like, am I making fun of someone's race, ethnicity, culture, tradition, gender, sex, or sexual orientation? But at the same time, these are things that happen all the time, right? Because we have fun with our friends and we say, oh, you throw balls like a girl, or, you go get some balls or something. We say little things like that all the time. And it's the one-off, and then it's the saying them all the time constantly to that person within a particular session, or what are we actually trying to get this individual to change about themselves, or what are we trying to get that individual to identify about themselves that makes them seem like they're different from how everyone else is looking. And so in this diagram, the first one is, am I making fun of that individual's identity? And would I make that same joke or action if that person's identity was not there? If this was a person's ancestor, would I make that same joke, right? So if it was like that person's grandmother or great grandmother, would I still say the same thing? And then if none of those things apply, if it's really not about their identity in any type of way, then most likely it might not be a microaggression. All right, so we're going to go back into a breakout group now. And this time in this breakout group, I want you to think about, before we get into addressing microaggressions, what do you think we should do? And this one isn't going to be as long. This one's only going to be about 10 minutes. And I want you to think about two questions. Do you think microaggressions can be avoided or prevented, and how? And then how can the effects of microaggressions be reduced? Okay, so those are the two questions that I want you to think about with your groups. How can microaggressions be avoided or prevented? And how can the effects of microaggressions be reduced? So you're going to talk about that within your groups, and we're going to just talk about that, just discuss that for 10 minutes. All right, welcome back, y'all. We only have a few minutes left, and before I turn it over to making this about what I've been saying, I really want to hear from y'all and what y'all came up with in your workshop. So if y'all could share out, what did y'all come up with for addressing these microaggressions? What do you think that we can do to avoid or prevent microaggressions, or how can we affect microaggressions or reduce them? So if you want to use the raise your hand button and I can call on you, or if you want to unmute yourself or add information into the chat.
I can paraphrase for room one. These were not all my ideas. We had a lot of really good ones. One was just being able to, as an ally, say like, hey, that was wrong when a microaggression occurs. Being able to point it out. Another really great point that came up was right at the end of having some sort of like instruction in how to go into these conflict training, so that people feel more comfortable addressing a person who's done that, especially if there's a power dynamic. And we thought maybe some more of the avoidance would just come from having really open discussions about marginalization, about race, and that would help people not commit as many microaggressions because they're a little more aware.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. I like that. All right, Carrie Hughes, you have your hand up. You would like to share?
Education, and preventing them is just education, because like you said, it might be something that you may have had like a one-off comment that you made, and it may be something that you heard. It's like, I think some people talked about having kids too, and it's about how you teach your children or what they hear at home and what they may not think is being an offensive comment, but once they get out maybe in the real world and say that, they're aware that it is an offensive comment. So I think education about what is appropriate when you're out amongst different groups of people, that's going to be the key in helping to prevent those.
All right. Anybody else want to share before I share what research says? And I get back to talking. All
I'll
right.
read out what's in the chat real quick, Christina. People are saying apologizing when we realize we have committed one, becoming more aware of like being sensitive to who's hearing the words we're saying, critical reflection after the fact, thinking it through, and the effect that it could have on the marginalized person.
Perfect. A lot of those are hitting exactly what they're talking about on here. So when we talk about addressing microaggression, it really talks about two systems for addressing them. The first way is the individual, for starting with yourself. So a lot of what you just said, being vigilant and understanding what your own biases are, no one can do that for you. So you might have to do some type of research to understand what are some differences amongst identities and how different identities and people want to be addressed, and understanding that your perception of these different identities may differ from what other people's are. And you can only do that by seeking out interactions with varying different types of people. If you do witness a microaggression, or you are a victim of a microaggression, there are different steps that you can do. You can ask for clarification. So could you say more about that? What you mean by that? You know, put an individual on the spot if you feel comfortable doing so. Or how have you come to think about that? Or maybe you might want to try to separate intent from impact by saying things like, I know you didn't realize this, but when you committed this behavior, it was harmful or offensive to me because of this. Or instead of, you could do this because your language or behavior was offensive to me. Or you might want to share your own process of that behavior, or what you would do or say in those particular environments. You don't want to be defensive in those particular types of situations, because remember, it's not about you. And you want to always apologize, even if the individual doesn't want to accept your apology, right? Because apology, as someone once told me, is about you kind of letting go. So you want to make sure you're always apologizing for your actions. Be open to discussing your attitudes and your biases. And you always want to actively stand against all forms of biases and discrimination, even if white fragility happens. And this is when you go and you are a minority and you go and you confront the issues, and you go and tell your supervisor that this happens. And then when they confront a white individual, and that individual just starts to cry and make it seem like their feelings are hurt, and then the situation becomes more about that person's hurt feelings than it does about the microaggression or the event that occurs. And so you spend more time trying to fix the other person's hurt feeling because you went and told, than about the actual event that led to you going and telling on them, right? And so you want to make sure that you're standing up against all forms of bias and discriminations and white fragility. And so you have to be an individual and be an ally, even if the microaggressions aren't coming against you. The second form of addressing microaggressions is called systematic. And so some people are even against using the word microaggressions, because if you are an anti-racist, then the only type of racism that actually occurs is systemic racism, right? And so if we are trying to get rid of any type of racism, we need to do policy changes. So how do we invoke policy changes within our systems? Because if we get rid of the policies that invoke racism, then that should fix all types of racism. So we need to create race conscious counselors that are advisors and mentor programs that address racial battle fatigue, because sometimes minorities are tired of fighting. We are mentally tired, emotionally tired, drained of having the same conversations over and over. So making sure there are counselors and representatives available to have those conversations so that individuals don't just keep quitting in engineering and in those STEM fields. And then limit the emphasis on standardized testings and devote ideas of hierarchical learning and experiences. Increase values on outreach and D&I efforts into tenure and promotion processes, and stop fix them programs where we need to change these minorities to be more like us. We need to stop these minorities from getting these bad test scores. So let's have more minorities in these after school programs to be so that they can catch up and be more like us and have better SAT scores. Let's stop trying to fix them to be more like us, thinking that there is something wrong with them because they don't do as good as this other culture, right? So those are ways that we can address the thinking of certain groups in order to kind of fix the underlying problems that are going on. And those prolonged kind of health effects are what we're really trying to get at, because these are not just mental issues, they're physical health issues that we all are trying to battle in some form or fashion. So my essential takeaway from all of this is that microaggressions are brief verbal behavioral and environmental indignities, whether intentional, unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative slates. They're insults. They have prolonged mental and physical health effects on individuals from marginalized groups. We can eliminate these microaggressions only due to activities that stand for change within ourselves and institutional policies. So with that, I'd like to say thank y'all for coming to the session today. And if you would like to learn more about microaggressions, these links that y'all have in the PowerPoint, there is a guide for learning to respond and address microaggressions. My email address is there if you would like to communicate with me about this subject matter. And then information for my LinkedIn and my Twitter is available as well. So please communicate with me if you have any additional questions, but I do appreciate your time and you coming to this workshop today. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina, for giving such a wonderful workshop. For those of you who are remaining, I did just post, we have a post-workshop survey that is in the chat. And so if you could take a couple minutes to take that survey, we would greatly appreciate it. We as the virtual workshop team will look at it. And we will also share the results with Christina. So if you have questions for her, you can also put them into the survey and we'll get that information to her. So thank you all for attending, and thank you again, Christina, for leading this great workshop.